Okay, yeah, so as you can see, there's not much detail about me on this slide. There's just my name. It's actually, yeah, that looks fine up there. So I'm just, in the program it says I'm from Bond University. That's where I just finished my PhD. So right now, thanks. So right now I'm just kind of in transition, coming back to Poland. And at the moment I wouldn't say I'm working. I wouldn't say I've got a job in the games industry because I'm freelancing. But yeah, funny enough, after spending 4 years researching the application of open world RPGs for cultural heritage, I find myself making a game about bees for kids. And I'm having a lot of fun with it. My kids love it, and that's cool. Okay, so yeah, today I'm going to just tell you. I'm going to be telling you about some of the methodology I used in my PhD. And just to be clear, this is mainly a methodological paper, so I will talk a bit about the results, but not that much. And yeah, to study the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, I used, or as they called it at my graduation, the Elder Scrolls versus Skyrim. That was a cool mistake, yeah. So I used an autoethnographic method to study Skyrim, and we'll explain what that is and how does it work and why is it useful. But in a nutshell, it's basically what anthropologists do in the field when they're doing participant observation. In other words, they're there. They're doing various things and they're taking notes and they're trying to think about themselves as well while they're at it. So we will have a brief summary of the data from the study, but that's again not really the focus here. And yeah, then at the end we'll talk briefly about how well immersive autoethnography, that's a hard word to pronounce 50 times in a presentation, how well it worked. And what issues there are with it, or what issues there were with my use of it. So as I said, this is based on my PhD study. And one of the things I've been lazy about is actually putting up my PhD somewhere where people can download it. I'm presenting again tomorrow, so I'll probably let you know then that I've put it up on academia, but right now, it does exist on on the internal network of my university. I think that's probably accessible through some of the various research networks, but I don't know how else you can get it. I am, of course, happy to email it to people if anybody wants. So what I wanted to do with my research was I wanted to examine open world RPGs like the Elder Scrolls series to see how well they can be used to convey cultural heritage rather than just pure fantasy, which is what they usually do. You know, the idea is if players can spend all this time, not just in the game, but also outside of the game, researching this world and trying to find out all about the world of the Elder Scrolls, how cool would it be if we could get people to take that sort of engagement into the real world and into real cultures and real history? So that was the basic premise of it. And I was looking in particular at how these kinds of games could be applied for indigenous cultures and especially the Aboriginal Australians. Now, the challenge with that, of course, is that if you want to study how a game goes about presenting a world, you have to look at the game world rather than just the game itself. You have to understand the level of detail that is in the game and how well it can be done. And incidentally, the Elder Scrolls Skyrim is one of those games that's often pointed out as a really good thing to imitate for people working with virtual heritage. In other words, if you're doing a project about showing medieval Italy, for example, or whatever else, you know, this is a great game for you to look at and to imitate because it does a lot of things really well. That's great, but what's your budget likely to be for that project? You know, $100,000, maybe? Maybe if you're plugged into all the right funds, maybe you manage to scrape up $1 million and you're a really rich researcher. Skyrim was developed with $80 million. And that's probably not counting the marketing budget, right? So it's a completely different scale. And so when you see people recommend that, you know, we should be doing things more like Skyrim, what the heck does that mean? How do we go about doing that? And this is why I really wanted to go into detail, to cut this world up into little details so that I could identify something more useful than just, do it like Skyrim. So that I could identify particular methods and strategies that were used in Skyrim so that people can look at Skyrim more from a perspective of, okay, we can't afford to do this thing that they did, but we can afford this one. And actually, this one works really well for our project. Now, the PhD itself also included two other big components, which we will not be talking about at all today. So there was an online survey of Skyrim audience engagement, which I think would be probably of great interest to the last speaker in this panel, but yeah. And there was also a sort of in-depth expert interviews with various scholars and practitioners working in video games, virtual heritage, and traditional cultural heritage. Happy to answer questions about those in question time, but right now we'll stick with the first component. So the first question is, how do people normally go about studying single-player game worlds? And the answer is that they don't. We generally study games, we being game scholars. We don't study worlds. There are a few exceptions which are very light on detail or on scope, or both, typically both. So, you can have a quick look across a bunch of worlds just to show, how sophisticated games have become and so on. Or you can quickly talk about, for example, the representation of Native Americans in Assassin's Creed 3, which is one of the papers I'm linking to here. But you can't really study a world in detail. And in fact, that's one of the big challenges in game studies is that, the bigger the game world, the harder even the game itself becomes to study. How do you go about studying what players do in a game like Skyrim, where there's so many different possibilities? Right from the start of game studies, back in the early 2000s, you had scholars like Espen Aarseth pointing to games like Morrowind and other Elder Scrolls games as examples of, have a look at this and tell me, how do you go about studying this? It's really hard, basically, is what they were saying. But the other question you can ask is, why would you take any interest at all in the game world? I mean, of course, you can study an imaginary world, and there are, for instance, geological studies done on Tolkien's Middle-earth. How well does it line up with actual, real geology and so on? You can do all these kinds of things. But while many people in this room would be very interested with those, most university funding committees are not. So the other thing that you can do with imaginary worlds is you can look at world building itself, which is the process of actually creating these worlds and how are they put together, how are they presented to the audience, and so on. Really interesting book, that one there. It has no practical information whatsoever if you're looking how to better design game worlds or other worlds, but it's a fascinating read about the history of the human imagination, really, of all the different ways that people have created imaginary worlds, not just fantasy and science fiction, but even things like early travel writing, which was in many ways fantasy. What is world building? I keep using this word, so let's have a quick definition. And I'm just going to read off the slide here. So it's the practice of creating imaginary worlds regardless of the medium. For our purposes, this doesn't mean just the process of creating the world, the content of it, but also the way you present it in the form, in this case, in our case, in the form of a virtual world, but it could also be in the form of a literary world or a film world and so on. Because of course an imaginary world, as the name indicates, it's something that the authors come up with, but really only as long as it only exists in their imagination, it's well, it exists, but only in their imagination, so it's not of very little interest to anybody else. It's when these things are put down on paper or made into a film or into a game that they become of interest to the audience. So that's why the element of presenting it is also important. So if you want to learn how to better go about world building, then you really need to study existing game worlds for their own sake, rather than looking at the game itself. Yeah, so, and yes, you're mainly interested, in this case, of course, you're mainly interested in world building methods, but to get to those, you need to look at the world. Yeah, of course, any sufficiently well-developed game world will yield to all kinds of scholarly methods applicable to reality. So you can look at a game world from the perspective of archaeology, as we saw earlier today. You can look at it from the perspective of geology, as I mentioned. 2 years ago, we had a really interesting presentation about the archaeology of dwarf fortress at this conference. But that doesn't actually bring us that much closer to understanding how the world comes together. It doesn't tell us about the methods that are used to put this content into place, about the strategies the developers pick in terms of how they put this content together. And just to give you a quick flash forward to the rest of the presentation, when I talk about strategies, I mean, for example, do we want to present this world from a subjective perspective or an objective perspective? Who here has played Skyrim? Who here has played Kingdom Come? Okay, not very many. But what Kingdom Come does is, apart from the game itself, it comes with a kind of built-in encyclopedia. And if you look at that encyclopedia, it's very objective in tone. It's very kind of, this is how things were. You know, this is how people lived in the 14th century in Bohemia and so on. And that's a world-building strategy. They want to establish their authority. The Elder Scrolls has been infamous for doing the opposite thing, where everything is subjective. There is no one view on any element of the world's history. As a matter of fact, there are events in that game world's history where if you ask the developers, well, you know, you've put 5 different versions of this event in different sources in the game, which one is the true one? All of them? That's the answer you will get. So another, I'm not even halfway there. Okay, so another thing you can do is virtual ethnography, which is something that's done very often for multiplayer experiences. But again, this is done mainly for online worlds, for MMOs. So it doesn't work so it hasn't been applied to single player games. So there was this methodological gap, which was what I was trying to fill in here. And of course, you could do this with a hardcore social sciences approach, where you go in there and you qualify and quantify everything inside that world. You try to research the heck out of it. But it doesn't really work because it just takes too much time. Now, but the thing is, there is a method that's used in the real world which can be applied here. You know, anthropologists do this quite often. Travel writing is a much more lightweight kind of way of doing this, but it also is a way of doing this where people travel overseas, they take notes, and then they describe the experience. So a similar approach has been proposed a few times for video games. So all I did here was I tried to apply it more to an open world an open world RPG in particular, and I tried to focus more on the world rather than the game experience, which is what they were usually describing in previous studies that use this kind of method. So this method, which has been called by Cuttle immersive ethnography, works this way. You basically play the game for a sufficiently long time span, and you keep a research journal along the way. So the research journal is what keeps you focused and keeps you structured. So you're not just playing the game and then writing up your feelings about it. You have your notes from along the way, and your notes allow the subjectivity of the experience to filter through, but to remain visible, but you also are able to be more objective looking back at this. So in my study in particular, what I did was I played the game directly for 10 to 20 hours. Not a very long time for Skyrim, you would find. Recording the experience in a journal, and in particular noting events, characters, whatever contributed to the game world building. Now, I already had 300 plus hours of non-research play on Skyrim, so that's why I was fairly confident that 20 hours would be enough. Not in the sense that, oh, well, I already know this game, so I don't need to play that long, but rather in the sense that I knew that the game is very repetitive in many ways, that in fact you can play the first 20 hours and get a sense of how the world is put together. Now, you won't know everything about that world, and you won't know everything about 90% of the content of the world, but you know how it's put together. And while keeping the journal, I also would add details from my past recollections, from game guides, from online resources such as fan wikis and so on. Altogether, there was 11 play sessions, total of 22 hours. And I did not record video, which I would do today, but I just didn't have the technological means at that point. And altogether, in my journal, I wrote out 36,000 words. So that's an amazing thing. You can write 36,000 words in 23 hours while playing a game at the same time. You can. One of the options, of course, would have been to record a voice journal instead. But then I would have had to transcribe it all. And incidentally, one of the cool things that happened when I was pausing time and again to take notes was that I started noticing the sound in the background much more in Skyrim. The sound is normally a world-building element that's almost completely invisible to you. But one of the great things about taking notes is that the sound keeps playing in the background. And yeah, while playing the game, I would be pausing for like up to 30 minutes, annotating it. It was an interesting kind of meditative process because one observation would trigger a whole chain of other observations. Like, this reminds me of what they did in Morrowind, and this is how it worked there. This is how it works here. I can see the difference now. Here's an excerpt which we're not going to read, but my point with this excerpt was to basically illustrate how similar it sounds to an anthropological experience. Like in this particular excerpt, I'm in somebody's house. I'm observing their daily kind of lives, the little motions they go through, the little conversations they have. It's of course, you're able to do a lot more than you would be able in real life. Like if I was observing people this close in real life, I would be arrested by the police. But in the game, it works. And one of the cool things about Skyrim is precisely that it gives this kind of that it's a world created for anthropologists in a sense. It's a world where everybody wants you to look at them and to study them. Okay, we're going to skip these results and just quickly get to the point. Yeah, I wish I could talk more about these management tactics, but clearly I've planned too much for this presentation. One of the notable things I will mention about the results is that is what can be called the world-building gestalt. So one of the things you will notice when looking at the literature about Skyrim is that many researchers were not that impressed. Like, yeah, okay, it does some interesting things, but it doesn't make me feel like I'm in a society. It doesn't make me feel like I'm in a real world. And then you look at what all the players are saying. It's like, I feel like I'm in a society. I feel like I'm in a real world. What's the difference here? Well, the difference is, of course, the angle that they're taking when looking at it. Researchers will be looking at pieces of the game. They will be looking at various elements. Players just allow themselves to be immersed. And what happens when you're immersed is that the parts come together into something, and your mind fills in the gaps. And all these things start feeling like a whole real world, even the things that aren't there. And that's why we're often able to forgive these kinds of things and still accept Skyrim as a really convincing world. Because ultimately, when we talk about the concept of presence in research, it's a feeling of being there. It's if a game has a good sense of presence, that means it really makes you feel like you're there. Well, that's a subjective term. Feeling like you're being there, which is interesting, of course, because many researchers try to come up with an objective measure of presence, but And I know I'm out of time, but just a quick illustration of this. You go into any marketplace in Skyrim, and what do you encounter? You encounter a whole bunch of stalls where nothing ever moves. No products are ever purchased. No money ever changes hands. The meat never spoils, even though it's been hanging there since day one of the game. Nothing ever changes. All the characters that show up there, they go through their daily routines, which are perfectly predictable. Yet you go into any of these places and you feel like you're in this marketplace where all these conversations are taking place. And all of a sudden, it feels very real and very convincing. And one of the simple tricks they used here was that they have all these different things happening all at once. So you have 5 different conversations, and as you walk up to the marketplace, they're already happening. So, you walk up there and it's, oh, the game doesn't care that I'm here to have the first half of this conversation. How rude. But that's how real life works. Like you walk into a marketplace and you hear all these conversations taking place, but nobody's waiting there. Oh, here you come, we can start talking now. So that's one of the ways they did this. So as I said, this presentation is primarily about methodology. So I just want to quickly sum up how this helped and what are some of the issues with it. Now, as I said, in some ways it replicates the process of that anthropologists would use when conducting participant observation. Conveniently, you dump a whole lot of ethical considerations that normal anthropologists would have. You're still talking about virtual characters here, so there's no ethics involved. Now, of course, in many cases, you will still want to look kind of behind the curtain at some of the more detailed mechanics behind the game. So in this case, I relied heavily on the game guides to find out what is really going on. How does Skyrim generate random events? Why did they choose this particular approach rather than another one? So the benefits, for one thing, it's feasible. You can actually study a game world this way, which I really couldn't find any other way of doing it. In Skyrim in particular, it works really well because the game is designed for the player to act like an anthropologist. I think for other worlds, for other games, it would probably require a longer engagement. Like if you haven't played the game that much, you would need to spend more time. And of course, if you want to find out more about the game world, then obviously you need to spend a lot more time. Skyrim Civil War is an event that's going to take place over 70 hours or so. You can't study it from the first 20 hours of the game. So yeah, it's effective as a player-centric study of the game experience, while still retaining some awareness of the fact that you're being very subjective here. Which is where we also mention problems very quickly. So firstly, in my research journal, I find myself constantly going off on different tangents to consider all the different elements, to add recollections of other parts of the series and so on. I found myself wondering towards the end, am I cheating here? Am I still really researching this game, or am I just writing my free-flowing recollections of other stuff? So it didn't feel very rigorous at all times. So how much did my other 300 hours of Skyrim gameplays contribute here? And would I be able to really study another world like this without having those 300 hours first? Can I just, I've played about 10 hours of Far Cry Primal. Can I sit down and do a study like this of Far Cry Primal? And will it be very convincing? Probably not that much. Yeah, so that's the real question that I ended up with. But yeah, I'm out of time and well beyond time now. So.
Yeah, for sure. I suggest that we keep questions for you, unless there's one very tiny one right now. Otherwise, we'll keep questions for you till the discussion session. I like the idea of free-flowing recollections of other stuff that basically describes my scholarly process.